After seeing the date on the newspaper, Theodore realised he was truly in the future. He continued on his journey, and soon had arranged George Cousins to deliver groceries to the hall, adding that he may need to give the gate a shove to one side to be able to get his lorry past it. He asked George if he could recommend anybody to come and look at the roof on the hall. Soon he was knocking on the builder Greg Paxman's door, and he arranged for him to come and visit the hall tomorrow to quote for the chimney and the roof. It was arranged also that his mate Cess was going to do the plastering and carpentry. He seemed glad of the work, as they were promised cash up front if they could do it in a hurry, with a bonus if they completed it in 2 months. So pleased, in fact, that Cess offered to drive him in his horse and cart back to Morrow Hall. After some small talk while they travelled down the drive, Theodore said to himself, "I think we need to try a few more short journeys to ensure the times agreed with the dates set on the dials. But for now, they would stay for a while at Morrow Hall and see what happened." Soon he was back with Constance and telling her his news, and he was beaming and said that they were indeed still alive and the plan had worked. He kissed her and she responded, taking him by the hand upstairs to one room which was not affected by the chimney fall. He said, "I love you," and Constance smiled and said she loved him too. Later they slept well, until the sound of a horse and wagon woke them. It was Mr. Cousins. Theodore quickly forced open a window and shouted down that he would be down shortly. Theodore dressed quickly and went downstairs. By the time he got down there, Mr. Cousins had already unloaded the wagon, and he placed it just inside the hall. He thanked him and said, "Would it be possible to have a lift with you back up into town?" "Of course it is," replied George. "I'll be back in just a second," said Theo. He dashed upstairs, told Constance that that's what he was going to do. He was going to go to the bank to release some more funds. Soon they were back in town, and after bypassing the teller, he asked to see the manager, Mr. Crook. A rather unfortunate name, Theo always thought. Soon now a bald man in his 60s faced Theodore and went through a similar experience to what he had in the tobacconist with Mr. Butt. The stocks had increased and Theodore was pleased, as prices had risen in the 10 years in his absence. On his return he found Constance was preparing a cheese and ham meal. Theodore had returned with 2 loaves and butter. As they sat looking at the papers, Theo suddenly said, "That's it, that's it!" He showed Constance the article. There was, in 1 week's time, to be an electric exhibition at Crystal Palace. Once more synchronicity seemed to be on their side. And 1 week later they had arranged transport and train tickets and were on their way to London. The electric exhibition, Crystal Palace. Bands were playing as Dr. Theodore Morrow and Constance arrived. They went through the vast entrance and were amazed at what they saw. It was full of people, thronging around all various devices and strange machines. They attended the introduction lecture and made a few notes of some of the small little lectures that were going to be happening through the day. Not that they expected to understand much of it. They wanted to know if anyone could explain time to them, and they debated how to broach the subject casually. They mingled around the exhibits and asked if anyone could suggest who may know about how time worked. They decided to split up and meet in half an hour at the entrance. Constance felt totally out of place, but soon found gentlemen fascinated by her Italian accent and good looks, volunteering to escort her to meet some friends who may be able to help. They spoke with eminent inventors and scientists, opening doors to the elite in knowledge at every conversation. Soon she felt a little more the wiser, but had no real idea how anything she'd learned may help. She saw Theodore across the hall and thanked her new friends, who took her to her husband. "Thank you, gentlemen," said Theodore. "My wife is very strong-willed, and bypasses many conventions in manners and formality." They said, "Oh no, that's fine, that's fine." They soon were praising her for her charm and personality, and eventually went their own way. Constance asked Theo, "What did you learn?" To which Theo replied, not a lot. 2 days later at Morrow Hall, they heard a carriage, and a knock came at the door. They opened the door, and a gentleman in his mid-twenties stood there. "Good day, Mr. Morrow. I apologise for arriving unannounced. If you could spare me a moment of your time, I am a teacher at Henley House School in London. My name is Herbert George." Theodore replied, "Oh, please do come in. You're welcome. Let me take your coat." He showed his new guest into the study. "This is my wife, Constance," said Theodore. Herbert's reply was rather sudden. Bowing his head very quickly, he said, "Hello, Mrs. Morrow. I saw you both at the exhibition at Crystal Palace. You're probably wondering who I am and what I want. Let me explain. I am an amateur writer, which I do in my spare time when I am not teaching. Apparently, I was asking very similar questions to various attendees and scientists as yourselves were. One of the gentlemen I was speaking to mentioned he had just been asked similar questions and pointed you out across the hall." Constance replied, "Did you learn much?" "We learned very little that we could understand." She noticed that their guest was looking through the window of the conservatory and realised he would probably be able to see the device. So Constance said to Theo, "My dear, won't you show our guest the machine Mr. Gryce has made us for taking exercise on? My husband has designed it so that we may exercise even when it is raining outside." Theodore gave a scowl only Constance could see, but soon turned on a smile as he turned to his guest. "Certainly, she always wants to show me off. Come through to the conservatory," said Theodore. Herbert replied, "Goodness, what a spectacular, splendiferous object! What are the materials used? They seem unusual." Theodore replied, "It does look splendid. Mr. Gryce did a grand job. He's yet to return to finish it. He's away in Japan on some government trade business. It works with the new-fangled electrical principle, similar to that used in stock tickers and lighting, I guess. He has an excellent grasp of the subject. I simply sketched out what I wanted. He is familiar with many new materials from all over the globe." Theodore went on, "My wife and I were debating with some scholars we had over after dinner, and one American fellow told us of a story in the New York Times he had read in 1881 or thereabouts, about a clock going backwards that enabled the fellow to travel the ether, and said it was all hogwash. We disagreed, saying it would surely be something our new sciences could create in a millennia or two. We were invited to a party in London soon after, and as we were going to London we thought we would go to the exhibition to see if it was a mere flight of fancy, you may say." Herbert replied, "I'm not familiar with that story, but I've partly written a story along similar lines. I will send you a copy when I've completed, if I may." Theodore replied, "That would be most kind. Would you like to stay for tea?" Herbert replied, "Unfortunately, I'd have to decline. I have to dash to catch the train back to London, and the chap I paid to bring me from the town will be getting impatient." Constance joined the conversation. "Well, thank you for your visit. It was nice to meet you. Please feel free to write if you learn anything, or to send us your story." Theodore, along with Constance, walked the gentleman out to his carriage and waved good-bye, and as he disappeared up the track into the distance, Theodore said, "Well, I think we duped the chap. He won't be asking too many questions. I'd forgotten that you could see the device from the study into the conservatory." Constance smiled and said he was a very nice young man. He had a bit of a thin voice, but he seems to have a good head on his shoulders. How did he know where we lived? You probably told some of the exhibitors, didn't you, Theo? Theodore replied, young Mr. Newton was there. The fellow met me at the telescope thingy near London. Oh, what's the name of the place? Constance added, "Oh, you mean Greenwich, at the observatory." Theodore, "That's it, that's the place near London." Theo suddenly stood deep in thought and said, "You know, the young man introduced his name as Herbert George. Do you think that was his surname?" The carriage picked up speed up the hill into Bishop Somerton, and soon their visitor, Mr. Wells, was on his way home. Over yet another cold meal of bread and dripping, washed down with now very mature wine from the cellar, the conversation turned as to what to do next. Constance, who had already thought it all through, said that they ought to stay here for a while after all. They had resumed most of their old life. Constance, pointing to the food, added that a kitchen maid, a replacement for Carter, and a new horse and cart would be nice. We must tell them that we would be leaving on another grand tour at some point, but they would receive 6 months' wages after we'd left. Theodore rested his chin on his hands and looked at her across the table. After a thoughtful pause he spoke. "We need to cover the device and not allow anyone in the study or conservatory. I will surround it with screens. We have one in the Chinese room for a start." Constance agreed, saying it would be interesting to save clippings of stocks and shares and events that could be useful to us in the past. We could visit the capital and speak with scientists and look out for new ideas and inventions. How long shall we stay? 3 months or more? After all, the repairs are completed soon. 3 months turned into many more. Soon the seasons had changed, and winter had a firm grip on England. The big house was cold, always had been, and Constance longed for the heat of Saturnia in Italy. She spoke one evening. I think we need to go away in winter to a warmer country. Theodore, standing with his back to the fire warming his hands and nether regions, replied that was a most excellent idea. But you forget, we can choose anywhere in the world, and even choose the season to go to. Spring seemed to take forever, but in that time all arrangements had been made. They still not dared to use the location dials, and Theodore said they must when they returned this time. They needed to know exactly how the device worked. Thomas suddenly put down the papers he was reading and leaned back in his chair. He placed his hands behind his head and he stretched. He could hear all the sounds of Oxford below him, and he thought, this story is just too fantastic. Even if it isn't true, it's a fantastic story. He felt he needed that coffee now, so he put the kettle on, made himself a coffee, and sat back down. He adjusted the cushion and got comfy in the old captain's chair and read on. Theo wrote, I took several similar small journeys of just a few hours into the future, just to check the device was operational still. It had returned me back to my relief, just minutes later than I had left. I got braver, and Constance began to join me. We cautiously journeyed further into the future. This time we went to 1896, which I may say was even more physically unpleasant. We still didn't learn much more, but we brought back with us newspapers and other clippings and articles that we knew we would be able to use. The next page began, all this you can read in my journal. From that point on, Constance and I visited many periods and times. We even tried to select other global locations, and found them quite useful. Over the following weeks, which turned into months and years, we became more confident in our travels. We knew which horses to pick in races. We saw inventions from decades in front of our time, and patented them in ours, copying and registering simpler versions of them. Many events we witnessed. All this helped us to amass a small fortune. Nowhere did we see any evidence that anyone had ever invented this machine, or that anyone had created a similar device. Once I dared to travel to the far distant future, and what I witnessed was shocking, and it chilled me to the bone. All I saw was war, men fighting a foe, the likes I cannot describe, but not human in form, but some mutation perhaps. That is indeed another story. On our other journeys we never met with the enemies of the traveller, or indeed the traveller. What to wear became problematic, and so we devised a fashion of sorts that we could pass off as perhaps a foreigner-made dress, such as a sultan and one of his wives, or a fortune-teller and her husband. This will be my leave of you in this letter, except to add that we believe it may be able to travel much further than we ever could imagine. I decided to add a further warning to this. Please take care. Do not take chances or alter events greatly. My hopes and concerns are with you and Letitia, and yes, we did visit on one occasion to a period in your time. This was so that we could put things in place with the solicitors. We could not help ourselves, but to see if your life was to be a happy one. With that in mind, and as not to reveal anything else, it is of vital importance that you are married before your 26th birthday, without fail, the year being 2028 years. In the year 2024, you will be the sole surviving descendant. In our old age we have chosen a time in which we both felt at home in. To minimise the risk of creating what we now know as a paradox, we chose to live in luxury in this other time. Our travelling days are over now. Constance had an unbelievable knowledge to her nursing skills during our travels, particularly to France, and managed to keep us going for quite a while. But we are now getting old, and illness is taking its toll. We will live out our old age, and we will die, and we will be gone by the time you are of age. Life has been good to us, so finally we wish the same for you and your family. Yours faithfully, Theodore and Constance Morrow. Added at the bottom of the document and underlined. Important. Please read the note I have put with the plans. Thomas sat back in his chair with a smile across his face. He quite liked Theodore. He sounded so much like himself. He wondered where the rest of the pages of the journal could be. Mr. Fartingdale never mentioned it. He laughed at himself because he got the name wrong. Theodore and Constance only returned to Morrow Hall for a few more times. It was once again for another long-term stay. However, they had an encounter with something they could not explain. A creature which emerged from a meteorite wreaked havoc, and they only just managed to escape on the device. By the time people came to the hall, the creature had unexpectedly expired, and a heavy rain had simply dissolved its huge form, leaving a layer of slime sinking into the earth.
There's something moving, I can hear the sound. There's something grooving, hear it wailing out loud. Across 1 billion miles, as an agate race, kept as a specimen, with meteorites from space. In the hot house of Dr. T Morrow, I hear glass breaking, it's growing out of control. It begins to wail like a cry from hell. Music like no sounds I've heard before. It was born in the surf of some alien shore. In the hot house of Dr. T Morrow. In the hot house of Dr. T Morrow. Now I see it stands 50 feet tall, with all its tentacles it beats on the roof of the hall. And with its 3 heads, notes as loud as hell, in harmonic fifths, hold a magic spell. In the hot house of Dr. T Morrow. the hot, hot, hot house of Dr. T Morrow. Bewitching as it sways from side to side. It reaches for me with fingers 20 feet wide. Slowly to the rhythm, it entrances and beguiles. Now I find we're dancing to a sound that drives me wild. In the hot house, Dr. T Morrow. In the hot, hot, hot house of Dr. T Morrow. Now we're grooving. Can you hear that sound? Soon it will be consuming everything around. I want to run, I want to look away, but it's too late, my fate is sealed, 'cause I rock and gently sway. In the hot house of Dr. T Morrow. Outside the hot, hot, hot house of Dr. T Morrow. Dr. T Morrow.
Dr. Theodore, I'm in trance.
Morrow Hall, end of June 2024. Thomas had looked at the plans and checked he had adjusted the mechanism. He followed the instructions, and some parts that were hanging loose were soon put back in place with a few ad hoc brackets. Levers were unbent and now operated smoothly, illuminating small areas of light on a panel near the power source. He added a box to carry anything he wished to take with him on his right side. He put on the carpet bag and now wore the fob watch Letitia had left him. He packed himself a few energy-type foods, consisting mainly of chocolate, an old film camera, some rolls of film, an old pair of binoculars, and rolled up in a wad of cotton wool a few spare valves, wires, pliers, cutters, several boxes of matches. Lastly, a wind-up torch he'd been bought one Christmas which he thought he would never use. He had written a will and had posted it off to the solicitors, told a few friends he was away for a few months, and decided tomorrow was the day to go. He simply had to guess where in the whole of time Letitia could be. He just told himself he had to use his gut feeling. His instincts were often correct. He often sensed something was wrong before it happened. Why then had he not known something was about to happen to the girl that he loved? Thomas stared out the window of the hall. If it takes me all my life, I will find her. I simply have no other choice. It was my fault.